and welcome to the SciFirst MovieTalk episode. So in this episode, I'll be discussing the 2002 independent Canadian science fiction horror film and sequel to the 1997 movie Cube, Cube 2, Hypercube, as directed by Andrzej Sekula. We'll go with that. What I would say is that if you haven't watched this movie, or more to the point, the first movie in the series before, then I wouldn't watch this review. Now, I'm going to try and keep it as spoiler-free as I can, but by insinuation, I may end up giving something away. And this is a film you need to watch off first off without knowing what's going to happen. And I think without any preconceptions about it at all, which would otherwise skew your enjoyment. And again, perhaps not so much for this film, as I'm sure most will give it a pass based on what I'm about to say, but moreover for the first, which really doesn't want to be spoilt before your first viewing. So if this applies to you, do switch off now, but please do come back to SciFirst MovieTalk and let me know what you thought of the films in this series. I would be very, very interested to know. Now, the first movie in the series was just simply out and out, simply extraordinary. It had one of the most original and intriguing premises that I had seen in a long while when I did watch it for the first time. I had only recently, however, prior to the series of reviews, actually found out that the movie indeed had not one, but two sequels which followed. This, Cube 2, Hypercube, which serves as the sequel to the original movie, and indeed the 2004 movie Cube 0, which serves as a prequel to the first. The two movies were, however, by all accounts, panned by either the critics, in the case of this one, or the fans, in the case of Cube 0. And the fact that I hadn't even heard of them before didn't kind of fill me with too much hope. Being a fan of the original Cube movie, I did have to check these out, however, regardless of how bad they might have been, I kind of had to see where they wanted to go, and where they kind of took that premise, that the ideas and things that were posed in the original. The cube is an interesting concept, an installation, if you like, in which a person or persons are placed unknowingly against their will, and within which are various rooms, some offering sanctuary, but others filled with booby traps offering near certain and instantaneous death. The reason for the cube, or indeed why anybody should be placed into it, remained a mystery in the first movie. Was it some kind of sick and twisted game, a government conspiracy, or just the whim of some fanatical billionaire? With thousands of possible rooms, any chance of escape is fleeting, but that has ever stopped the human condition from persevering against such insurmountable odds. So, then, this instalment takes the concept of the original movie and now sees a new selection of hopefuls wake up inside the cube. This time, one which has evolved from the first iteration to bring rooms with not only physical traps, but those which can bend gravity, reality, and time itself. Disorientated, the group looked at each other for answers, finding only more confusion and disbelief at their situation, as the world around them becomes the impossible. With no seemingly possible way out, tension and suspicion runs high, resulting in a macabre game of survival against time itself. Now, doesn't that sound juicy, And indeed, I can argue that the ideas presented in this movie are absolutely superb from a science fiction standpoint. They certainly prove food for thought, But compared to the original, well, this is nothing like the original. It may follow the same premise to some extent, and indeed supposedly set in the same universe for what it's worth. References are actually made to a previous iteration of the cube throughout the film. But otherwise, the two films could have been totally disconnected for what it was worth. This entry comes across as being way overcooked, without building on the foundations laid by the first. It went way too big, too fast, and without the necessary resources to do so. Sure, it had some fantastic concepts of its own, but the film in the main was far too saturated and off its own beaten track for most of it to be taken seriously. The whole design of the cube is different. This is Mark II. So I expected changes, don't get me wrong, but this version concentrated more on the science fiction and the fantastic than it did on the raw, unforgiving nature and the despair of the cube itself. Gone are the cube's intricate designs, replaced with bright yet sterile looking box, functional, very plain and basic. Gone are the more dystopian elements. Uniforms are replaced with civilian clothing. We even have more objects brought into the cube this time around, from briefcases and pens to knives. The dialogue and the cinematography is also off. The first wasn't brilliant, but this one plays like a cheap backdoor pilot for a TV show. The characters I just found so hard to swallow. I mean, they played well enough, sort of what you would expect from a B-movie, but they all give them, a fair go. I can't deny. They just don't, however, feel right for what the tone of the movie should have been. In fact, this movie almost comes across as a comedy. It is played that daft at times. Everybody actually seems to be having a good time. It never really builds on the same sense of tension as its predecessor. There's lots of shouting, but little substance, It feels too frantic, too cluttered, without really offering the viewer very much in return. It tries to offer something of a twist, but unlike the original movie, there's no challenge to be solved as such, no maths challenge to get your head around. Just a bunch of repeating numbers that never really play a part until right at that very last moment. I expected a challenge, some intrigue. I got none in this respect. This time around, there may be a reason for the cube. There seems to be a plan, and more than one connection between those held captive within its walls. But in this, as it tries to offer us more, it actually provides less. It just seems so lackluster, and I did want answers, I did, but this just seemed like an expected conclusion, if you like. Too easy given the trouble they went to create the cube. It seemed like there should be more. Surely there's more, right? But they boil it down to an arms race, basically, of a multinational arms company of sorts, or government torture. Just didn't sit right given the first movie. It really just doesn't have that same grey grit or sense of doom as the original. Not quite as dystopian or futile. It does, however, warm up towards the end. The science fiction concepts, as much as it struggles to kind of find this balance between being overly complex and overly simplified, and indeed way too much, some are brilliant, and that I must admit. This time around, we substitute the more random and individual traps of the first cube for more targeted and singular traps. This time around, it's almost like the whole cube itself is a trap, with a mind of its own. There are some disturbing moments for sure. Getting killed by a fractal is quite an interesting way to go. But the first had grounding. As much as I like the traps and ideas in this movie, they are still fantastical and just simply aren't executed as well as they should have been. And in this, the special effects are questionable. And given the depth that they went for and the extravagance of the premise this time around, it's noticeable. Really, the effects do not meet the requirements of the scope of this film at all. Overall, this was a fairly disappointing sequel to Cube. I must admit, it had some fantastic ideas, but in the end, it was perhaps too clever for its own good. I am glad I watched it, don't get me wrong. The traps are quite ingenious, very next level, and indeed there were some sound science fiction concepts here for sure. The ideas are certainly there, and the film resonated with me long after I watched it, so it is a good sign that it kind of piqued my interest at the very least. But this one is really just a flight of fantasy, more confusing than anything else. In its mission to kind of create something more than the first movie, it forgot everything that made the first movie as intriguing and captivating as it was. It didn't have that same kind of dark and futile charm that the original had, and the lack of any kind of real puzzle was probably one of the most disappointing things about it. So, That brings me to the end of this episode. Many thanks for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please leave a like. Please do hit that subscribe button for more movie reviews, trailer reactions, and other movie-related content. Absolutely loved having you at SciFirst Movie Talk, and definitely love to have you back. Most of all, just thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.